Shalom. We're doing Perek Ches, and we discussed in the previous Perek that Shmuel was Ma'orer Am Yisrael to Tshuva, and in particular they repudiated Avodah Zorah, and because of this Hashem gave them peace and tranquility and victories over the Plishtim. And now we are talking about the end of Shmuel's life. Vayihi kasher Zakein Shmuel, when Shmuel became old. Now the emes is, Chazal actually say, Shmuel was not old at all. Shmuel died at the age of 52. He prematurely turned old. In some ways, Chazal say this was because of the unfortunate words that Hannah used. Hannah pledged that she would give, if she had a child, she would give the child to Hashem ad olam, forever. But the problem is, ad olam in the Torah is yovel, 50 years. And since she brought Shmuel to the Mishkan in Shiloh at the age of 2, she essentially cursed him that he would only live for 50 more years, 52. So this is a premature zikna. Vayosem espanav sheftim liYisrael, and he appointed his sons to kind of take over his job as sheftim. Vayihi Shem b'nai habachor Yael. His oldest son was Yael. Now some say this is actually the Navi Yael of Treyasar. Some say it's a different Yael. Now you'll see in a moment why identifying him as the prophet Yael is a problem. V'shem Mishneu, and the name of the second son, Aviyah, and they were shoftim beBeer Sheva. So instead of Ramah, which is the center of the country, they set themselves up in Beer Sheva, which is in the Negev. Now the pasuk then says, "V'layholchu banav bidrachav." His sons did not follow his ways. Vayatu acharei habotza. Now, if you mean this quite literally, they were inclined towards theft and extortion. Vayikchu sheichad, and they took bribes. Vayatu mishpat, and they perverted justice. If you read this quite literally, these are very, very serious averos. Geneva, theft, extortion, blackmail, bribery, perversion of justice. Very, very serious averos. This would make them Rishayim. The Gemara in Shabbos says, however, that anyone that says that the sons of Shmuel committed these sins in a literal way is making a mistake. Because the beginning of the pasuk simply says they didn't follow the ways of their father. They weren't Shmuel. That doesn't mean they were mamish Rishayim. So the Gemara in Shabbos explains, the way Rashi understands it, that their only sin, if you can even call it a sin, was that unlike Shmuel, that we just read about in the last perek, who would go from place to place to place to place, they stayed in Beer Sheva and they made the litigants go to them. Now, how is that connected to bribery? Because in your regular place, you have your staff, you have your secretaries, you have your assistants, you have your shamashim. And as a result, by people having to go to the main court system, they had to pay money to various officials, and that was treated in Ruchnius as a form of bribery to make the administrative system wealthy and the like. So according to this, you see, if you learn that they were Rishayim Mamish, it's not Shayach that the Navi Yael would be a son of Shmuel. If, on the other hand, you learn that the only mistake they made was they didn't travel around, they remained in place, so it's Shayach that, in fact, they were tzaddikim. Ad kedei kach, that Yael, the Navi, could be the son of Shmuel. But be it as it may, people saw that the sons of Shmuel were not Shmuel. And they felt they needed a leader. Shmuel is getting old. And now we come to one of the most famous stories in Shmuel. The people demand a melech, a king. Vayiskaptzu kol ziknei Yisrael. the elders, the manhigim of Am Yisrael, gather together. Vayavo el Shmuel haRamasa, they come to Shmuel's home in Ramah. Vayimru elav, and they say to him, Hine atah zakanta, behold, you have become old, again, prematurely old. Ubanecha leholchu bidrachecha, and your children are not following your ways, they are not as righteous as you. We cannot look at them as your successor. Ata sima lanu melech l'shavteinu b'gechol hagoyim. Give us a king so we can be judged like all of the people. Instead of having a shofet, which is a temporary thing, and after the shofet dies, you got to find a new shofet. And sometimes it's the son, sometimes not. Give us a monarchy, give us a malchus, give us a permanent structure so we can be kechol hagoyim. And the pasuk says, Vayera hadavor b'einei Shmuel. This request, which came from Ziknei Yisrael, was very bad in the eyes of Shmuel. Kasher Amru, when they say, Tanalanu melech, give us a melech lishaftenu, to judge us. Because number one, Shmuel felt that they didn't have gratitude to him. They want to replace him with a melech. But number two, kechol hagoyim, a Jew should be governed by the Torah, by Hashem's law, by the Chachamim, not by political leaders. If you want political leaders, you want a melech kechol hagoyim. That means you are rebelling against Hashem. The Torah is not good enough. And Shmuel didn't like the idea. Vayispalel Shmuel el Hashem, and he prayed to Hashem, is this good idea or not a good idea? Should I do it or not? Vayimer Hashem el Shmuel, and Hashem says to Shmuel, Shema b'kail ha'am l'chol asher yimru elecha. Listen to what everybody says. Do what they want. Not that it's a good idea, but loy eischa ma'asu. They are not rejecting you, Shmuel, as a person. Ki oisi ma'asu mimloch alehem. They are rejecting me. They are saying that it's not enough to have Hashem as our melech. Because ideally, what do you need a melech for? Hashem is your melech. You keep the Torah. But the very fact that they need a melech means that the Torah is not enough. And this is consistent. They've done so many things from the day that I took them out of Mitzrayim until today. They have rebelled against me. V'yazvuni, they have abandoned me. V'yavdu Elohim acherim, they worship other gods. Kain hema isim gamlach. They're doing to you, Shmuel, what they did to me, rejecting your leadership. V'yata shema b'kailam, listen to their voice. If that's what they want, give it to them. Ach ki ha'ei ta'id bam, but warn them. He gadad alahem mishvad hamelech asher yimleich aleihem. Give them all of the laws of the melech and how oppressive it's going to be. It'll give them a chance to withdraw their request. But if they don't withdraw it, then give it to them. Again, this parsha has a tremendous arichos among the Meforshim, because it's very clear from this parsha that it seems to have been sinful for them to ask for a king, that asking for a king is a rejection of the Torah, a rejection of Hashem. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says they are rejecting me and they're rejecting you, Shmuel, just as they have done so many times since they left Mitzrayim. But the problem is very obvious. In Parshas Shoftim, it says that when the Yidden want to have a melech, kechol hagoyim, and it says even kechol hagoyim, that's in the Torah itself, it says, Saim tasim alecha melech. There's a mitzvah to have a king. The Rambam says it's a mitzvah saseh to have a melech. So the kasha is, if there's a mitzvah to have a melech, then why is Shmuel so angry at them? And why is Hashem angry at them for asking for the melech? So there are many answers to this question. I'll just mention two of them. The Rambam himself asks the kasha, because the Rambam says in Hilchos Malachim that there's a mitzvah to have a melech, but the Rambam's answer is that It's a mitzvah to have a melech taka, but the Yidden's motivation is not a proper motivation. Shmuel understands that they're not asking for a melech to be madrich them in the derech HaTorah, but they're asking for a melech because they want to be like the other nations. They want to have a king rule over them, not necessarily al pi Torah. And their kavana is shalo kahaygen. And because their kavana is shalo kahaygen, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give them a melech that definitionally cannot last, because permanent malchus has to come from Shevet Yehuda, which would be David HaMelech. But this malchus from Shaul, by definition, is gonna fail. So since their motivation was Shalo Kahaygen, HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them a malchus that's not going to last. This is how the Rambam himself understands it. The Nitziv has a bit of a different mahalach in the Hamikdover and Chumash. The Nitziv says the following: it is sinful to feel that you need a king, because if you have a society that is committed enough to the Torah, they will keep the Torah even without a king. And if occasionally they need to go to war, they can have a shofet on an ad hoc basis. But says the Nitziv, even if it is a sin to want a king, to need a king, once you've shown that you have this weakness, that serving Hashem is not enough to be mechayev you, then you have to appoint one. So this is the interesting paradox. It was a sin and a weakness to need it, but once you need it, it becomes a chiyuv. So it's both a mitzvah saseh when you ask. That's how the Torah is written. If you ask for a king, you must have one. But it would have been better had you not asked for a king at all. Right? That's how the Nitziv understands the parsha. So now, Shmuel is going to tell them, try to dissuade them, by telling them all of the bad things a king is going to do to them. And we actually paskin that this is legal. In other words, the king has the halachic power to do these things. That this is not just referring to a dictator who is going to break the rules, but fakert, this is actually what the rules of Malchus are. This is called Mishpat Hamalucha, the laws, the prerogatives of royalty. By Yamer Shmuel called Eskol Divrei Hashem Elohim. Shmuel communicated the Divrei Hashem, that Hashem wishes they wouldn't have asked for a melech. Hashayelim me'itay melech, the people that were asking for a melech. Vayomer, and Shmuel said, Zeh yiyah mishpat hamelech asher yimlech aleichem. This is the law, the prerogative of the king that will rule over you. Es b'neichem yikach, he can take your sons into royal service. He can draft them into the army or draft them into working for him. He'll take your sons, v'samlo b'merkavto b'parashav. He could put them in charge of his chariot and his cavalry, his horse riders. V'ratzu lifnei merkavto, and even just to glorify him, they will run in front of his chariot. V'lasum lo sarei alafim b'sarei chamishim, and he will put over your children generals over 1,000 people and even over 50 people. V'lachareish charishay, and they will be impressed into service. They will plow his fields. Likzar ketziro, they will harvest his crops. V'laseis klei milchamto, they will make weapons for him. Uchlei richvo, and all of the kalim that he needs for his riding. I mean, not just his riding, but the riders of his army. That's what he'll do to your sons. They will be taken from their homes and ordered into royal service. V'yes b'noseichem, and your daughters who will not be in the army, yikach l'rakachot u'letabachot. They will be spice makers. They will grind up spices. Tabachot, they will be cooks in kitchens. Ofot, they will be bakers. So he can take your sons, take your daughters. V'yes sedoseichem, v'yes karmeichem, v'zeisechem hatayvim, and your grain fields and your vineyards and your olive trees, hatayvim, which are productive, yikach, he can confiscate property, this is eminent domain, v'nosan li'avadav, he will give it to his slaves, v'zarechem v'karmechem yasor, and even what you're able to keep, you may have to give meiser, a 10% tax, this is taxation, property tax, arnuna, v'nosan l'sarisav v'yavadav, and he will use that money to finance his royal court by giving it to his servants. V'yes avdeichem v'yes shivchoseichem v'yes bachureichem hatayvim v'yes chamoreichem yikach. And once again, your slaves and your maidservants and the young men that serve you, not your sons, but your own servants, he can take away from you. Your donkeys. V'yasal lemlachto, and they will work for him. Tzonechem yaser, 10% of your sheep. V'atem tila lavadim, and overall you will be slaves. Uzakatem b'yayimhum lifnei malkachem asher b'chartem lechem, and you will cry out and complain about the king that you chose. V'lo yana Hashem etchem b'yomo, but God is not going to answer, because Hashem is going to say, this was your choice and I warned you. So this is the last chance to back out. And the pasuk says, "Vayima'anu ha'am lishmoha b'kol Shmuel." They refused to listen to Shmuel. They were fixated on having a king. Vayomru lo ki melech yiya aleinu. We want a king. V'hayinu, and they emphasize hayinu gam anachnu kechol hagoyim. We want to be like everybody else. And this, of course, is the fatal mistake, because Am Yisrael can never be like everybody else. Ushvatanu malkeinu, let the king judge us. Not Nevi'im, not Shoftim, not Gedalim. V'yatza lefaneinu, may he go out. V'nilcham es milchamoseinu, and he will lead us in war. V'yishma Shmuel, it's called Divrei, and Shmuel heard what everybody said. V'yidabreim bi'oznei Hashem, and he went back to Hashem to report. Now, obviously, Hashem knows what happened, but it means Shmuel is going back to Hashem to talk about this. Vayayimer Hashem el Shmuel, Shema b'kailam. As Chazal say, B'derech she'adam rotzei leilech meilichen, I say, the way a person wants to go is the way Hashem will take him. They want it, give it to them. Now, again, as I mentioned from the Nitziv, if they're on this madrega where they need a melech basar v'dam, it actually becomes a chiyuv. Himlachto lahem melech, give them a king. Vayayimer Shmuel, and Shmuel then says, okay, you have your request. Everybody goes home, and I will take the next step. Shmuel said to Anshe Yisrael, L'chu ish li'iro, every person should go back to his city, and I will get you the king that Hashem tells me to choose. Ad kan perek ches.